Hello students, I am Dr. Madhusri Haldar from Department of Botany, Serampur Girls College. That is the last video regarding the Palaeobotany and Palynology, and today our topic of discussion is branches of Palynology and their applications. So we have to recap one thing, that is what is Palynology. Actually, Palynology is a scientific discipline concerned with the study of tiny particles like plant pollen, spores and certain microscopic planktonic organisms in both living and fossil form. And these are the different branches of Palynology. Number one is Palaeopalynology, then Palynotaxonomy, Forensic Palynology, Neopalynology, Pollen biotechnology, Melissopalynology, Aeropalynology and Entomopalynology. So start with the ancient one, that is Palaeopalynology. It is very clear from its name, that is it is a study of the fossil pollens. So actually, Palaeopalynology means study of the pollen grains of prehistoric era. In archaeology, prehistoric fossilized pollen grains are also found with the fossil. So when a plant fossilized, it is very obvious. If it is a seed plant, then their fossil is also, their pollen grains are also fossilized with the pollen grain. Next, study of the organic microfossil reveals a lot of things about the past vegetation, the climate of the past, and the flora and fauna. Flora means the total plant vegetation, and fauna means the total animal population of that time. And Palynology tells not only about the plants but also about the environments, because if we get a pollen of a xerophytic plant like cactus or some other xerophytic plant, we can have, or we can get an idea about their environment, because xerophytic plants are preferred to grow in a dry condition. So we can guess the environmental condition of that time. So Palaeopalynology means not only the study of pollen grains of the prehistoric era, but also from the pollen grain we get many ideas. And one more thing is very much important for the study of Palaeopalynology, that is the sporopollenin, because it is the most important component that protect the pollen grain. Once that pollen grain get buried in sediment, they tend to stay there and protect the pollen grain. Next thing is the Palynotaxonomy. Palynotaxonomy means the study of spore morphology of embryophytic plants and pollen morphology of the seed plant. The contribution of Professor Artman, who is the proposer of the NPC classification of pollen grain on pollen morphology, that proposal or classification marked a beginning of a new phase of plant taxonomy. Artman and many palynologists all over the world made available pollen description of all angiosperm family, including most of the genera, species, etc., to the taxonomist. Taxonomists employ pollen morphological attributes in systematic work, that is, in solving a controversial taxonomical and phylogenetical problem and the identification of different plant. When controversy arises, that can be solved with Palynotaxonomy. And here the pictures of different pollen grains from Asteraceae family. It can be very clear from the pictures or diagrams of the pollen grain, that one family has many types of pollen grain depending upon their genus. Even species to species, pollen grain may also vary in structure and shape and etc. So here I will show you, and that is the picture, that is a plant actually, Centura, which is very common garden plant, and the first 6 diagram of pollen grains of this genus. Okay, but the species are different. That's why the different types of pollen grains are there, and that is another very common plant, that is Anthemis. Here the 9th number pollen grain is the Anthemis pollen grain, and that is different from the another genus of the Asteraceae family. And very common plant to us, that is the Catharanthus roseus plant. The pollen grain of Catharanthus roseus is like that, and that is also very common, hibiscus and or China rose, and the pollen grain is like that. So from this branch of Palynology, taxonomist will get benefited, because from pollen morphology taxonomical problems can be solved, and NPC classification is a pioneer, or is a very good source of this type of study, and this classification system is very much helpful for the taxonomist. Next branch of Palynology is the Melissopalynology. Here is a picture that honeybee move around a flower, and Melissopalynology is the branch of palynology that deals with the study of pollens that found in honey. Actually, when the bees collect nectar from flowering plant and carry it back to their hive, where they use it to make honey. Actually, they don't use the pollen to make honey. Some grains of pollen usually make their way into the honey, since the bee can't help picking some along the nectar. So depending upon this, it is this information actually very much useful to the study of the nutritional value according to the presence of pollen grains in it. So once we get some pollen grains of some medicinal plants, so obviously these pollen grains have some antibacterial or antifungal property in it. So in this way the honey is very helpful, or honey work as antibacterial, antifungal, and for relief of cough and cold, for only the presence of this pollen grain in it. So in this way Melissopalynology helps us a lot. This information is also helpful to the scientists and industrialists to improve the quality of honey. Next branch of palynology is Aeropalynology. So, what is Aeropalynology? Aeropalynology is a branch of palynology that relates to the study of pollen and spores that are dispersed in the atmosphere. The study also includes their eventual dimension, deposition, and impact on human system. Obviously, aeropalynology has a great impact on human population or human system, because allergy or allergenic reaction is nowadays very much threatening disease in human population. So many people have allergic reaction to various type of pollen. Some palynologists study that the structure of pollen grains to understand why they elicit allergic reaction in people. Palynologists also study the distribution of different types of pollen during different season of a year, and this can help allergy sufferer that when and where they are most likely to get sick by the pollen grains, so they can potentially avoid these areas or this time and reduce their symptom. Here is the pollen calendar actually, that in late winter and spring the pollen grains of trees are dispersed, and some example of trees are oak, ash and willow that disperse their pollen grain during the late winter and spring. And in late spring and summer the pollens of weeds are pollinated or dispersed by the air and some other pollinator. And here is some example of the weeds that are Rhodope indica, Tridax, etc. And the last thing is the grass pollen that pollinate or disperse their pollen during summer and autumn. And fucus, cyanodon, corn, etc. are some example of grasses that disperse their pollen grains during this season. So if we get a knowledge about the pollen calendar, we may get relief from this type of allergic reaction. Next branch is forensic palynology, and that is very much useful today, not only in India but it is actually very much useful in foreign country. In this branch, here actually the pollen grains are collected from the victims and the suspect actually. Characteristic features of pollen grains help to many forensic cases studies. For example, nature of pollen grains found in the body parts or bag or shoes, etc. of the suspects and the victims can give us the idea of occurrence of the crime and to identify the exact criminals. So it is very much helpful for forensic study for to solve the criminal cases. And sometimes the scientist may also wash up the stomach content or the internal organs for collection of the pollen grains. If they get a pollen grain of different areas or different plants, so that may be a huge information to them. And this type of study actually is very helpful in New Zealand, Australia, Europe and USA, because why this type is very much useful, because pollen grains are abundant everywhere and they are identifiable and well dispersed in air, and in few cases the plants are actually very localized, and that is very much helpful for the scientist and for the investigator also. Next branch is Entomopalynology, that is we often see that is the pollen grains on insects body and insects organs. So how it is helpful? One branch of palynology deals with the study of pollen that collects on insect, known as entomopalynology. So study of pollen that collected from the insect's body. And many types of insect eat plant. In this purpose, they often pick up grains or pollens in their bodies and ingest it along with the plant parts. These pollens can be collected and analyzed to learn more about the feeding pattern of various insects, and it is also helpful to study of the migration pattern of insect, because different areas produces different types of pollen grains due to environmental factors and also for their developmental patterns. So if we got pollens of different kind of from different kind of plant, we can get an idea about the migration pattern of the insects and also the food behavior of the insect, and this information help the farmers keep track of insects that might damage their crop. Next branch is Neopalynology. It is a branch of palynology which deals with the structure of pollen grains of present day plants and their roles in mankind. While we have studied earlier that Palynology, which deals with the pollens of the prehistoric era or fossilized pollens. Here Neopalynology informs us the diversity and distribution of the plants all over the world, their time of flowering, and how do they pollinate. That is very much helpful for further study. Next is pollen biotechnology, and that is very much useful nowadays to botanists, to palynologists, to biotechnologists, because cross-pollination is advantageous as it provides variation and recombination. Hence, by pollen biotechnology, male sterile plant can be generated to inhibit self-pollination, because if a plant self-pollinated, this plant lost variation, and for generate or for create new variation, cross pollination is very much important. So different plants have different pollinators, therefore number of pollinators specific to the vegetation can also be increased by pollen biotechnology. There are many pre-fertilization barrier or post-fertilization barrier, hybrid sterility, or due to the environmental factors, pollen can be non-viable. All these three barriers to fertilization can be overcome by pollen biotechnology. By anther culture, haploid plants can be developed, which are important in research, because some plants are not generated by their seeds, or not germinates through their seed. So this type of plant can be conserved or preserved by their anther culture. Pollens are rich in protein, carbohydrate, mineral, and vitamins. Hence, it is good supplementary food also. And pollen present in honey as antibiotic properties, and pollen tablets are also available nowadays. So, pollen biotechnology has an important footstep or important impact on our mankind. So that are the branches of palynology and their usefulness. I thought this video is very much helpful for the student, and thank you. That's all.